The Texas sun was merciless. It poured down on the sprawling tarmac of Fort Hood like molten metal, cooking everything it touched, steel asphalt people. The smell of heated jet fuel lingered in the air, mixing with the faint tang of burnt hydraulic fluid. Far in the distance, heat waves shimmered, making the hangars look like they were melting into the horizon. The flight line was alive with movement. Ground crew in faded tan coveralls hustled between aircraft, some pushing tool carts, others bent over open engine bays. Every so often, the mechanical whine of an auxiliary power unit would rise above the noise, followed by the deep, bone-shaking thump of rotor blades spooling up. The sound of an AH-64 Apache coming to life was like no other part, machine part beast. Specialist Rachel Carter knelt in the shadow of one such beast. The Apache above her loomed like a predator, its desert camo skin streaked with dust. Its stubby wings bristled with hard points, the chin-mounted M230 chain gun hanging low like a clenched jaw. Dust clung to its every seam. The faint scarring of sand and debris told stories no one on the maintenance roster would ever write down. Rachel's ball cap was pulled low, her sunglasses reflecting the hard glare of the sun. Her coveralls were streaked with oil stains, the knees worn from hours on concrete. Her hands moved quickly, but deliberately, as she disassembled the M230's feed system, each motion fluid and practiced. A layman would think she was just following a checklist. A closer eye would notice the subtle, almost unconscious way she inspected each component, rotating it, weighing it, running her thumb along a surface. Not because the manual told her to, but because she knew how it should feel when it was right. To anyone passing by, she was just another mechanic on another sweltering afternoon shift. To the other crew members, she was the quiet one. She didn't make small talk, didn't waste time leaning on toolboxes during breaks. She worked, she ate, she vanished. But there was something in the way she handled the weapon that didn't quite fit the picture of a regular maintenance specialist. Most crew treated the M230 like any other machine part, unbolt clean, reassemble, sign off. Rachel handled it like it was alive. She knew the sound it made when the feed was dragging by a fraction of a second, the exact resistance in the charging handle, when the spring tension was optimal. These weren't things you learned from a maintenance manual. These were things you learned because your life, or someone else's, had once depended on it. The M230 chain gun wasn't a weapon you took lightly. It could chew through vehicles, structures, and if the pilot was steady enough, individual targets from nearly 2 miles away. At 625 rounds per minute, each tungsten round could tear a man-sized silhouette apart in less time than it took to blink. Rachel had cleaned hundreds of them in her career, but she'd also fired one more times than she cared to remember. No one here knew that. The midday heat pressed down harder, and she wiped her forearm across her forehead, leaving a streak of black grease above her eyebrow. She didn't notice. Her hands moved with an efficiency that almost looked like muscle memory: strip, inspect, reassemble, torque to spec. Every few minutes, she glanced at a notepad beside her, scribbling notes in small, tight handwriting. The others on the line didn't know why she kept her own log instead of just filling out the standard digital checklist. They didn't ask. It was a habit she couldn't shake. Too many times in the past, standard procedure had been the enemy. When you'd been in situations where a single loose link or jammed casing could mean the difference between walking away and being zipped into a body bag, you didn't trust standard anything. The Apache she was working on, tail number 328, was due to fly soon. She'd been assigned the job that morning, though she hadn't needed to be told the urgency. The gun had been jamming intermittently on the last 2 flights. The pilot had chalked it up to a worn belt link. Rachel knew better. Her fingers worked the feed assembly free, exposing the worn sprockets. She felt the teeth with her fingertips, her brows tightening. They weren't just worn. They were scored in a way that told her they'd been dragging under pressure. That meant either a misaligned chute or a subtle bend in the mounting arm. She'd seen it before once in Kandahar. A memory tried to push forward, but she shoved it back. Not here. Not now. A crew chief walked past, giving her a brief nod. "Almost done, Carter?" he asked over the clatter of nearby tools. "Almost," she replied without looking up. He moved on, not noticing the speed of her hands or the way she checked each part twice before putting it back. The flight line kept moving, a living organism of steel and sweat and urgency. But Rachel worked in her own quiet bubble, the rest of the world reduced to background noise. Then behind her, she heard boots on concrete, not the scuffing, fast-moving steps of another ground tech. These were slower, deliberate. She didn't turn, but her shoulders stiffened slightly. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away. A shadow fell across her workbench. Rachel didn't look up. Years of habit told her that looking at someone too soon gave them more than they needed expression, mood, a read on her. Instead, she tightened the retaining bolt on the feed tray, listening without appearing to listen. The sound of the boots alone told her enough heavy, solid leather, the creak of someone who walked like they owned the space around them. A pilot. She slid the locking pin into place, her hands still moving at the same steady pace. "Specialist Carter, right?" a man's voice said, above her warm, casual, too casual. Rachel gave a small nod without looking up. "That's me. Captain Aaron Mitchell," the voice replied. "This is my bird you're working on." Now she glanced up briefly. He was in a green flight suit helmet, tucked under his arm visor down, to keep the sun out of his eyes. His hair was cut short, but not regulation short, the kind of trim pilots got away with. Sweat darkened the fabric along his collar and sleeves. He had that easy posture most pilots carried, lean, but coiled, like they were always ready to step into the cockpit and disappear into the sky. "How is she running?" Mitchell asked, nodding toward the Apache. Rachel didn't answer right away. She set down her wrench, peeled off her gloves, and picked up her notepad, flipping it open. "Jamming issues, not belt feed," she said finally. "Sprockets are scoring. Mount's probably off by 1/2 a degree." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. 1/2 a degree. She met his eyes now. That's all it takes at 625 rounds per minute. It was a small thing, but Mitchell noticed it the way she didn't dumb it down, didn't soften the numbers for him. Most ground crew would have just said, "It's misaligned." She gave him the technical truth like she assumed he could handle it. "Not bad," he said with a faint smile. He shifted his helmet to his other arm, glancing over the gun mount. His eyes drifted toward her shoulder and stopped. Rachel's coveralls weren't new, but they were clean enough that the patches stood out clearly. On the left arm was the standard U.S. Army name tape. On the right, the unit patch for the aviation battalion, and just below that, subdued in black and olive drab, was a smaller, non-regulation patch. Mitchell knew it instantly. His eyes narrowed slightly, and his casual posture stiffened without him realizing. It wasn't flashy, but the design was unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time in certain circles. A black field, a single silver dagger pointing down wings, spread wide behind it, and a coiled serpent beneath. No text, no numbers, just that symbol. He'd seen it only twice before in his career, once, in a classified briefing folder he wasn't supposed to keep, and once on the shoulder of a man who'd walked into a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan, stayed for 2 hours, and left behind a cleared map grid that had been an enemy stronghold the day before. It was the kind of patch you didn't buy, didn't request, and didn't wear unless you'd been there. The kind of patch most people in the military didn't even know existed. "What's that?" he asked, his voice almost too casual. Rachel glanced at her shoulder as if she had to remember which patch he meant. "Old unit." "Special ops," she said, with a non-committal shrug. "Different job long time ago." Mitchell studied her. There was no hesitation in her voice, but there was also no opening to dig deeper. She'd given him just enough to acknowledge the question without actually answering it. He'd met people like her before, the kind who carried classified histories, like they were carrying a second set of dog tags, always there, never shown. Still, curiosity hitched at him. "I think I've seen that emblem before," he said. She didn't even glance up from the gun she was reassembling. "A lot of people think they have." There was something about the way she said it, flat, almost bored, that told him she was used to people asking. More importantly, she was used to ending conversations before they started. Mitchell could have left it there. He probably should have, but that patch gnawed at him. "You ever do door gun work?" he asked, changing tack. Rachel's hands didn't pause. "Once or twice." That answer was vague enough to mean nothing, and yet her tone carried the weight of someone who wasn't talking about a joyride in a training bird. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the metallic click of her securing the latch and the distant roar of another Apache taking off down the runway. Mitchell shifted his weight. He could feel the heat radiating off the tarmac through the soles of his boots. This was supposed to be a quick check-in before his pre-flight briefing. Instead, he was standing here trying to read someone who clearly had no intention of being read. Finally, she looked at him again, eyes hidden behind dark lenses. "You'll be good to go in 20. Just don't ride the trigger unless you have to." Mitchell frowned slightly. "And why is that?" Her answer was simple. "Ammo's heavy, and sometimes you don't need as much as you think." She went back to work, effectively ending the conversation. Mitchell stood there for another moment. The urge to push a little harder tugged at him, but something in her tone and in that patch told him that pressing her would be like poking a sleeping rattlesnake. He gave a small nod, stepped back, and turned toward the operations tent. But even as he walked away, he found himself glancing over his shoulder. Rachel hadn't looked up. Mitchell's gaze locked on the small piece of cloth sewn to Rachel Carter's left shoulder. At first, he thought it was just another subdued morale patch. Ground crews often wore them half the time, with inside jokes or obscure unit art. But this wasn't a joke, and it wasn't obscure to him. Black field silver dagger pointing down wings spread behind it, a serpent coiled beneath tongue extended. No words, no numbers, just a silent claim. His breath slowed, not from heat or fatigue, but from something far older memory. He'd seen that emblem twice before in his career. Once in a sealed briefing folder stamped with a "Red Eyes Only," tag, the kind of file you had to read in a guarded room and return before you left. And once in Afghanistan, on the arm of a man who'd stepped onto their forward operating base in silence, stayed just long enough to speak privately with the battalion commander, and then vanished without a sound. It was an insignia for a program that officially didn't exist. No name, no public record. A joint tasking element that pulled assets from across the special operations spectrum: Army, Navy, Air Force, sometimes even CIA paramilitary. The kind of people who didn't just show up in a war zone, they changed it. Most soldiers could serve 20 years and never meet someone who wore that patch. Even fewer would recognize it for what it was. And yet here it was on the arm of a woman kneeling in the dust, cleaning his Apache's gun. "You don't see many of those," Mitchell said, nodding toward it. He kept his voice casual, but the edge underneath was sharp. Rachel didn't look at the patch. She didn't need to. Old unit, she said simply. What kind of unit? She set down the feed tray, picked up a cleaning brush, and began working carbon out of the receiver. Different job, long time ago. Mitchell let the silence stretch. Years in the cockpit had taught him that people often filled silence to make it less uncomfortable. She didn't. Finally, he tried again. Special ops. Her eyes flicked up just long enough to meet his. Behind the dark lenses, he couldn't read her, but he could feel the weight in the glance, a warning and a dismissal all in one. We all have pasts, Captain. There it was, the conversational dead end. Most people would have taken the hint and walked away, but the emblem gnawed at him. You didn't just bump into someone from that world, and you sure didn't find them turning wrenches on a flight line in Texas without a story behind it. You know, he said, leaning slightly closer. I think I've seen that before. Kandahar, maybe Bagram. Rachel's hands didn't pause in their work. A lot of people think they've seen it, she replied evenly. It wasn't a denial, and it wasn't an admission, just a statement designed to close the door without slamming it. Mitchell's mind began turning over possibilities. There were a few reasons someone with that patch might be here working quietly in an aviation maintenance slot. Most of them weren't voluntary. Sometimes operators rotated out for medical reasons, injury, burnout, political fallout. Sometimes they just disappeared into the machine, reassigned somewhere safe, until their file gathered enough dust to be forgotten. But the way she moved, the speed, the precision, he doubted she'd been sent here to fade away. People like her didn't stop being dangerous. He looked down at the M230 she was working on. The gun was a beast, 30mm chain-driven, effective, out to nearly 2 miles. Most mechanics saw it as just another system to maintain, but she handled it differently, not like she'd read the manual, like she'd written it. You ever fire one of these? He asked. Once or twice, she said without looking up. Her tone was neutral, but the words carried an undercurrent. Once or twice, the way a surgeon might say they'd done a few heart transplants. Mitchell almost asked more, but then a fragment of memory surfaced unbidden. In eastern Afghanistan, his patrol had been ambushed in a narrow cut in the terrain that trapped them under plunging fire. He'd been in the air that day, providing overwatch in his Apache, but the enemy's position was tight, too close to friendlies for him to engage without risking his own men. Then, movement in the dust shapes breaking from the rocks. Muzzle flashes controlled and precise. The kill zone collapsed in under 3 minutes, and just like that, the shapes disappeared, leaving nothing but silence and a few empty casings that didn't match any weapon his unit carried. Later, a rumor had spread. One of those operators was a woman. No one had confirmed it. No one could confirm it, but the patch on Rachel's shoulder now looked exactly like the one the rumors had whispered about. He straightened slightly, realizing he was staring. She didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did, and simply didn't care. You'll be good to go in 20 minutes, she said, sliding the bolt assembly back into place with a metallic clunk. Just don't ride the trigger unless you need to. That made him pause. Why is that ammo's heavy? And sometimes you don't need as much as you think. It wasn't a line you picked up from maintenance school. It was a lesson you learned in the field in the middle of a fight. She turned back to her work, effectively ending the conversation. Mitchell stepped back, helmet under his arm, but his eyes lingered on the patch. He'd spent his career tracking threats in the air. Now, for the first time, he was looking at one on the ground, quiet, contained, and pretending to be something she wasn't. As he walked away toward the ops tent, he glanced back one last time. She hadn't looked up. Mitchell didn't go straight to the ops tent. He walked past it, taking the long way around the flight line. his mind circling the patch on Rachel Carter's shoulder, like a hawk riding a thermal. The emblem had hit something deep in his memory, and the way she'd handled his questions only sharpened his curiosity. He'd been around special operations types before. They came in different flavors, some brash, some quiet, some so ordinary looking, you'd never guess what they could do. But the ones who were really dangerous shared a particular trait. They never gave you more than they wanted you to have. Rachel fit that perfectly. He doubled back, taking a slower pace, and by the time he reached his Apache again, she was tightening the last bolt on the M230. The smell of gun oil hung in the air, cutting through the scent of sun-baked metal. She didn't glance up when he stopped beside her. "Looks like you've done this before," he said. She gave a small shrug. "That's the job." "Yeah, but I've been in this unit long enough to know when someone's just doing their job and when they've done it under fire." Her hands paused for a fraction of a second, not long enough to be obvious, but enough for him to catch it. She resumed, tightening the bolt. "What makes you say that?" "The way you check everything twice. The way you don't look at the manual, and that thing you said about riding the trigger. That's not from any maintenance course I've ever heard of." Rachel set the torque wrench down and picked up her notepad. A pilot who notices too much usually ends up with extra work. Mitchell smirked. "Good thing I'm used to it." She didn't smile back. Instead, she signed the maintenance log, tore off the carbon copy, and handed it to him. "She's good to go." He took it but didn't leave. "Where'd you learn all this, Carter?" Her tone stayed level, her eyes hidden behind the mirrored lenses. "Different unit, different job, special ops." "You really like that question?" she said, her voice carrying just enough dry amusement to make him wonder if she was humoring him or warning him. He chuckled. "I do. You should try answering it." Rachel finally looked up, and in that moment he understood why the conversation felt like pushing against reinforced steel. Her gaze wasn't hostile. It was controlled, like she was measuring him the way she might measure the effective range of a target. "Captain," she said evenly, "if I told you where I've been, you'd either stop believing me or start asking questions you don't want the answers to." The words landed with a weight he didn't expect. There was no ego in them, no bluff, just quiet certainty. Mitchell opened his mouth, then closed it again. Around them, the noise of the flight line rolled on an Apache lifting off down the runway, a Black Hawk taxiing to its pad voices over radios. None of it seemed to touch the bubble of stillness between them. Rachel picked up her gloves, tugged them on, and moved to the other side of the gun mount. "You've got your pre-flight in 10. You should get to it." He hesitated, then stepped back. "All right, but you've got me curious now." "Curiosity is dangerous," she said without looking up. Mitchell walked away this time, but his mind was already working through possibilities. People like Rachel didn't just end up on a flight line in Texas for no reason. She'd been somewhere, done something. The question was, what and why was she here now, acting like none of it mattered? As he reached the edge of the tarmac, he glanced back. Rachel was already bent over the gun, again, shoulders squared, her movements calm and precise. She looked like any other ground crew from a distance. But Mitchell now knew better. That night, Mitchell couldn't sleep. The barracks were quiet, except for the faint hum of the AC unit and the occasional creak of cooling metal outside. But his mind wasn't here. It was back in the Afghan mountains, in a place where the air smelled of cordite and burnt rubber. It had been a routine escort mission, or at least it was supposed to be. His Apache and his wingman had been covering a convoy through a narrow valley. The ridges were steep and lined with rock faces that looked like they'd been carved to hide rifles. Halfway through the pass, The ambush hit. The first RPG streaked out from a ridge on their right, exploding near the lead Humvee. Small arms fire erupted from both sides of the valley. Mitchell had called out enemy positions, his voice steady despite the chaos. But then came the sound that froze him, a second volley of RPGs, this time from behind. They were surrounded. His wingman took a hit rotor damage. He had to peel off limping toward base. That left Mitchell alone, circling low, to buy time for the convoy to find cover. But the fire was too heavy, and fuel was running low. That's when the radio crackled with an unfamiliar voice. "Piper 1, hold your orbit. We're moving in." He'd looked around, scanning the ridges. No friendly call signs were on the roster for this op. Whoever they weren't supposed to be here. Then, out of the dust, they appeared 3 figures in dark, unmarked gear, emerged from the rocks, as if they'd been there all along. They moved with an economy of motion that made your skin crawl, not fast, not slow, just inevitable. One of them, a smaller figure with a compact rifle, slid into position behind a slab of stone and began picking targets off with mechanical precision. Mitchell had never seen shooting like it. Every round hit something that mattered: a trigger hand, a weapon scope, a man just about to fire an RPG. In less than a minute, the volume of incoming fire dropped by half. The convoy seized the chance engines roaring as they pushed through the bottleneck. Mitchell laid down covering fire, but honestly, the mysterious trio didn't need much help. They owned the battlefield. When it was over, he tried to get eyes on them through his sensors. But just as quickly as they'd appeared, they vanished, slipping back into the rocks and dust, without a word. All that was left was a final burst of static over the comms. "Viper 1, you never saw us." For years, that voice had haunted him. He'd asked around discreetly, but no one admitted to knowing about any such team. Some chalked it up to stress. Others said maybe he'd picked up chatter from a classified unit he wasn't cleared for. He'd almost convinced himself to let it go until today. Because when Rachel Carter spoke on the flight line, there had been something in her tone, calm, unshaken with that same quiet certainty. And though he'd only heard the mysterious shooter over comms, back then, Mitchell would have bet his flight pay it was the same voice. He sat up in bed, rubbing a hand over his face. Could it really be her? The idea sounded crazy, and yet her reflexes, the way she handled the Apache's gun, the effortless precision, it all lined up. But if she was that shooter, why was she here now, cleaning machine guns instead of running black ops in some remote corner of the world? Mitchell knew one thing: if he wanted answers, he couldn't just ask her straight out. People like Rachel didn't hand out the truth. They made you earn it. The next morning, he got his chance. Rachel was already on the tarmac when he arrived, crouched beside the Apache running a systems check. Sunlight glanced off her mirrored lenses. She didn't look up when he approached. "Morning," he said. "Morning, Captain," she replied. He watched her for a beat. "You ever been to Afghanistan?" The pause was microscopic. Then she said, "Once or twice." "Ever work in the mountains near coast?" She set down the checklist and finally looked at him. "Why do you ask?" "Because I was there when some ghost unit saved my convoy from getting shredded. There was a shooter, small frame, fast hands, perfect aim. Sounded a lot like you." Rachel studied him for a long moment. Then she stood wiping her gloves on her pants. "You sure you want to keep pulling on that thread, Captain? You might not like where it leads." Mitchell felt the corner of his mouth twitch into a half smile. "I think I'll take my chances." Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture did, like she was weighing whether to brush him off again or let him in just far enough to warn him. She leaned in slightly. Then you'd better be ready to hear things you can't unhear. Before he could reply, the loudspeaker blared, calling all crews to prep for an urgent sortie. Rachel turned away, grabbing her tools, and just like that, the wall between them was back up. Mitchell followed, but now he was certain of two things. Rachel Carter wasn't just another mechanic, and she wasn't done surprising him yet. By the next morning, the air on the base felt different. It wasn't just the humidity or the shimmer of heat rising off the tarmac. It was the low thrum of anticipation that rolled through the flight line like static before a storm. Word had spread that an unplanned exercise was going down, high level. No one knew exactly what it was, but everyone felt it. Captain Mitchell had heard the rumors, but it wasn't until he walked into the hangar and saw Rachel that he realized she was part of it. She stood near the Apache, her hair pulled back tighter than usual, her uniform sleeves rolled down and buttoned, and that patch, the same one from before, was gone. Instead, there was nothing on her shoulder but plain fabric. "You're in early," he said, stepping closer. Rachel was checking the M230 again, but her movements were sharper, more deliberate. "Had some things to prep." "For what readiness drill?" she said without looking up. "They're evaluating rapid response capabilities." Mitchell frowned. "We do those all the time. Why's command crawling all over it?" Her hands paused for just a heartbeat. "Maybe they want to see who's paying attention." He caught the edge in her tone. It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't casual either. "You're acting like you've done this before." "Maybe I have," she said, snapping the ammo feed cover closed. Before he could press, a voice echoed from the far end of the hangar. "Carter on me." It was Major Hollis, the kind of officer who didn't waste time calling out maintenance techs by name. Rachel gave Mitchell one last glance, then strode toward the major, her steps clipped and purposeful. Mitchell pretended to busy himself with the pre-flight, but his eyes followed them. Hollis leaned in close, speaking too quietly for anyone else to hear. Rachel nodded once, then twice. Her posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable. She wasn't just a mechanic getting orders. She was someone receiving an op brief. Minutes later, the sirens blared. The readiness drill was on. Blackhawks and Apaches roared to life across the flight line, ground crew scrambling in orchestrated chaos. Mitchell climbed into his Apache with his co-pilot, Lieutenant Harper, running through the checklist in double time, but he couldn't stop wondering why a maintenance tech was suddenly in the middle of command movements. They were airborne within minutes. The exercise scenario piped over the radio described a surprise insurgent strike on the perimeter. Units were tasked with intercepting and neutralizing a convoy of hostile vehicles attempting to breach the southern gate. It all felt too polished, too real. Halfway to the southern range, Mitchell spotted her. Rachel was in the belly of a Blackhawk ahead of them, headset, on gear strapped down tight. She wasn't carrying a wrench this time. She was carrying a short-barrel rifle. "What the hell?" Harper muttered through the intercom. Mitchell didn't answer. He'd seen enough by now to know that whatever Rachel Carter's official title was, it wasn't the whole truth. The drill unfolded like a real engagement. Apaches strafed targets on the move. The Blackhawks dropped their insertion team onto simulated hot zones. And right in the middle of it, Rachel moved like she'd done it 100 times, clearing mock hostiles, signaling her team, never wasting a step or a round. By the time the exercise ended, the chatter on the base comms was electric. No one could figure out why a ground crew member had just outshot half the special operations troops in the drill. Back on the tarmac, Mitchell intercepted her before she could disappear into the hangar. Not bad for a mechanic, he said. She glanced at him, face unreadable. You saw what you saw. I saw more than that, he pressed. And I'm starting to think you're not here to just clean machine guns. Rachel's eyes flicked to the patchless sleeve on her shoulder. Sometimes, Captain, the less you know, the better you sleep. And with that, she walked away, leaving him with more questions than answers, and the sinking feeling that the truth was far bigger than he imagined. The base was still buzzing from the readiness drill when the sirens blared again, this time sharper, more urgent. The voice over the loudspeaker wasn't the calm, scripted tone from earlier. It was clipped, almost strained. This is not a drill. All flight crews to stations. Ground teams initiate lockdown protocols. Repeat, this is not a drill. Mitchell froze for a second in the cockpit of his Apache. Harper's head snapped toward him, eyes wide. That's not part of the schedule. Before he could respond, his radio lit up with encrypted chatter. Real encrypted chatter, not the open band training traffic they'd used earlier. Command was reporting an unidentified aircraft inbound at low altitude. No transponder, no response to hails. Across the flight line, Black Hawk rotors spun up again, but this time without the casual efficiency of a drill. Crews ran, weapons were loaded, and the base's air defense systems began to hum alive. And in the middle of it all, Rachel. She wasn't in her coveralls anymore. She was in full tactical gear vest, strapped tight helmet, clipped under one arm. A sidearm rode her hip. A rifle was slung across her chest. The patch was back on her shoulder, but this time, Mitchell saw it clearly before she passed. It wasn't a maintenance unit insignia at all. It was black and silver, minimal, a dagger flanked by two off-furled wings. Joint Special Operations Command. She caught him looking but didn't flinch. Get your bird hot, Captain. You're going to need it. Mitchell stepped toward her. What's going on? Her voice was low but firm. Inbound threat. Could be a recon probe. Could be worse. Either way, I'm riding with you. That stopped him cold. You're not on my crew manifest. You want to waste time on paperwork, she said. Or do you want the best chance of making it back? He studied her for half a beat, too long. The hum of urgency around them was turning into a roar. He didn't know who she really was, but he knew she wasn't bluffing. Fine, he said, jerking his head toward the rear seat. Strap in. Minutes later, the Apache lifted from the tarmac, its 30mm cannon, armed Hydra rockets loaded. Rachel sat in the co-pilot seat headset, on scanning the terrain below, with practiced precision. Contact will be over ridge in 2 mics. The AWACS controller's voice crackled in their ears. Through the canopy, Mitchell saw other Apaches fan out in a defensive arc. Blackhawks hovered in reserve, loaded with quick reaction teams. Rachel's hands were already on the weapons console. Your running point. I'll manage fire control. Mitchell almost argued this was his aircraft, but there was something in the way she said it calm and absolute that made him let it go. Then the contact appeared, not 1 but 3 aircraft fast movers hugging the terrain. No national markings. The AWACS controller's voice tightened. Unidentified aircraft heading 230, vectoring toward restricted zone. All units intercept. Mitchell's gut went cold. Whoever they weren't lost tourists. Rachel was already designating targets. Bird 2, take lead on the flanker. Bird 3, peel high right. Her voice was smooth, confident, like she'd been running air intercept ops for years. The first hostile banked hard, cutting toward the Apache line. Mitchell pushed the cyclic forward, feeling the machine surge. Rachel fired a warning burst from the 30mm close enough to get their attention. They didn't break off. Engage came the command from AWACS. Mitchell squeezed the trigger. The gun barked tracers, stitching across the sky. One of the fast movers jinked, but clipped the tree line, trailing smoke. The others veered, breaking formation. "Target 2's breaking for the perimeter," Rachel said. "We can't let it get close to the fuel depot." Mitchell banked hard, following her vector calls without thinking. She was reading the battle like a chessboard, predicting moves before they happened. When the dust finally settled, 2 of the intruders were downed outside the base perimeter. The third had turned tail, disappearing low over the horizon. Back on the tarmac, crew swarmed the Apache. Mitchell climbed out, adrenaline still spiking, and turned to Rachel. She was already walking away toward a group of officers waiting near the ops building. Not just any officers, colonels, commanders, people who rarely set foot on the flight line. One of them shook her hand like she was an equal. That's when it hit him. She wasn't here undercover for fun. She wasn't some special ops tourist playing mechanic. She was embedded, watching, waiting for something just like this. And now Mitchell knew her cover was gone. The debrief room was silent, except for the low hum of the projector fan. Mitchell sat at the far end of the long table, helmet still in his hands, flight suit streaked with sweat and dust. Across from him, a panel of senior officers was reviewing real-time footage from the Apache's gun camera, the moments where the drill turned into a combat intercept. Rachel wasn't in the room yet. He wasn't sure if that was because she was being interrogated somewhere else, or because she was in a meeting even higher than this one. Either way, he was still replaying her voice in his head. Calm, certain, deadly accurate, calling intercept vectors, as if she'd been flying Apaches her entire career. Finally, the door opened. Not a guard, not an escort, Rachel. Only this time she wasn't in maintenance gear. She wore a flight suit darker than standard issue patches, stripped except for a single emblem, that black and silver dagger and wings insignia. No name tag, no rank. The colonel at the head of the table stood. "Captain Mitchell, this is Chief Warrant Officer Rachel Kane, Task Force, Talon Joint, Special Operations Command." Mitchell's mind caught on the name. He'd heard it before, once buried in a classified after-action report from a mission in northern Syria. The kind of report that came redacted into Swiss cheese, where whole paragraphs were just black bars. She gave him the faintest nod, then turned to the colonel. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" The colonel nodded. Rachel leaned against the table, eyes sweeping the room. 2 weeks ago, SIGINT picked up chatter suggesting a hostile reconnaissance flight was planned over this base. The attackers would test our radar coverage, reaction time, and air defense coordination. The assumption was that they'd try to make it look like an accident. She glanced at Mitchell. "I was inserted undercover as maintenance crew to assess flight line readiness from the inside. My orders were to stay off the radar, literally and figuratively, unless the threat materialized." Mitchell frowned. "So the drill, that was you, or rather, that was my way of testing what we had," she said. "The enemy was watching. They've done this before. Send in a small fast strike package right after a drill, hoping we're too winded or too confident to respond quickly." The colonel tapped a folder in front of him. They were right to be worried. Thanks to her, the base was already spun up when the actual threat appeared. Rachel's eyes didn't leave Mitchell. "And thanks to you, we had a gunship airborne in time to stop them from hitting the depot." There was a pause long enough for the weight of it to settle in the room. Mitchell broke it first. "You could have just told us who you were." Her expression didn't change. "You know that's not how it works. If I'd told you, you'd have been looking for me instead of watching your sector. I needed to see how you operated without the safety net of knowing Special Ops was watching your back." He wanted to be angry, but the truth was, she was right. The drill had pushed them. The attack had tested them, and they'd come through. The colonel closed his folder. Chief Kane will be rotating out tonight. Transport's already arranged. Mitchell blinked. That's it. She just leaves. That's it, Rachel said softly. My job here is done. If I stick around, it only draws questions we don't need. She started toward the door, then stopped. For a moment, the professional mask slipped just enough for him to see the woman behind the operator. You flew well today, Captain. Not just well decisively. That's rare. Coming from you, he said. I'm not sure if that's a compliment or a warning. Her lips curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. Maybe both. And then she was gone, leaving the scent of jet fuel and cordite in her wake. Night fell fast over the base. The runway lights glowed in the dark, casting long shadows over the tarmac. Mitchell stood at the edge of the flight line helmet, under his arm, watching a blacked-out Blackhawk lift from the far pad. No running lights, no transponder, just a dark silhouette fading into the horizon. He had the feeling that was the last he'd see of Rachel Kane, unless the world caught fire again. And yet, as the rotors faded into the night, he knew something had shifted. The drill hadn't been just a drill. The fight hadn't been just a fight. And the woman who'd walked onto his flight line, as just a mechanic, had left as something else entirely, a ghost in the system, a shadow with wings. Somewhere out there, she was already moving to the next hotspot, the next target, the next moment when a base would hear the words, "This is not a drill." In the searing heat of Fort Hood, where the Texas sun beats down like a relentless forge, Chief Warrant Officer Rachel Kane's story unveils a profound lesson about the power of understated resilience. Disguised as a mechanic, her oil-stained coveralls and quiet demeanor hid a past etched with the intensity of special operations, revealed only by a subtle patch that stopped Captain Aaron Mitchell in his tracks. Rachel's precision, with the Apache's M230 gun, wasn't just technical skill. It was a testament to a life shaped by high-stakes missions, where every decision carried the weight of survival. Her journey teaches us that true strength often lies in the shadows, in those who carry their scars silently and act decisively when the moment demands. In our own lives, how often do we overlook the quiet colleague, the unassuming neighbor, or the stranger whose past holds untold courage? Rachel's story urges us to embrace humility, to recognize that everyone has a hidden narrative that shapes who they are. Her ability to blend in yet rise as a leader in crisis reminds us that heroism doesn't always shout, it whispers through actions that save lives. This is a call to look deeper, to honor the unseen battles others fight, and to approach every interaction with empathy and curiosity. Who in your life has surprised you with their hidden strength? Share your stories in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. If Rachel's tale of quiet valor moved you, hit that subscribe button and join our community to uncover more stories of unsung heroes. Let's celebrate the shadows with wings together.